So, something I've long thought about, and particularly since COVID-19 started, is the phenomenon of how people perceive history, particularly how people perceive events of geopolitical importance. And what I mean by that is you'll often have something happen that is significant. And I say this all the time on my channel, and it seems like this is going to change everything. This will change the flow of history. And yet in other ways it seems that absolutely nothing happened. The first time I was really aware of this phenomenon was back when I was in university. It came out that North Korea had nuclear weapons, and people were freaking out. People were saying North Korea is going to invade the South. They're going to start a nuclear war. There were some gullible people who thought North Korea was going to invade Canada somehow. And in a sense, it was a big change because it put a big question mark over any future military conflict between America and South Korea on one hand and North Korea on the other, now that they had weapons of mass destruction. And at the same time, it seems like nothing really changed. There wasn't a war, the borders didn't move, the sanctions continued. And so you had this situation where it seemed like something very fundamental was different, yet everything remained exactly the same. And if you actively follow geopolitics at all, you will find, and I'm certainly guilty of this, people all the time saying this event changes everything. This is the like major step in the decline of America. This is a changing in the world balance of power. And people will constantly say that, and it'll seem like very little actually changes with regards to the external reality. And that's kind of a paradox I've long really thought about because it just seems like an inherent contradiction. How can an event happen that maybe in a couple hundred years you might perceive as being highly significant and someone realizes it's significant, but at the same time they don't really see the changes that it's made? I hope I'm making sense. Like with COVID, we all talked about the collapse of the global market. We talked about the breakdown of supply chain. Now, for my part, there was still food in the supermarkets. The global supply chain went through all these issues, but there was still food. I could still afford to buy it. I know that wasn't the case for other people, but more or less, the global supply chain is still there. It's just extremely stretched and bent and stuff like that, compared to how it was before. And people were talking about that. People were talking about how the airline industry was going to be completely destroyed, how people's attitudes towards social interaction were going to change forever. Just all the massive societal changes that COVID 19 was going to bring. And even I said that. I thought COVID was going to go on a lot longer, but it eventually did stop, and a lot of things have returned to how they were previously. And you just kind of have to ask this question. And I've said this a couple different times. Well, that happened, well, this like catastrophic thing went by, and then it seems no, nothing fundamentally changed. And so there's a couple explanations I've come up with this. The first one that I've come up with is normalcy bias. That is, there is a natural equilibrium to things, and systems tend to be extremely resilient. And you can call this pathway dependency or whatever you want it, but my point is all the factors that went into creating that system go into sustaining the system. The structure of the economy, the structure of the political system, and yes, even the individual interests of the people who prop it up and control the system. All of these things are attempting to hold it to a certain equilibrium. People mostly fear change, and in particular, they not so much maybe superficial change, but they fear fundamental changes to the way their lives are, particularly if they are able to make ends meet. So that was kind of my first thought. My first thought was the normalcy bias and the tendency for things to reach an equilibrium is so strong, particularly after the Cold War ended and we have the whole end of history. There's no more a historical dialectic thing, that you had one kind of narrative or one kind of historical stream going, and then that was so strong that anything that attempted to deviate from that would immediately be snapped back. The idea of the end of history was that now that communism had been destroyed, the world would just gradually speaking get more and more liberal, more and more globalist, and we'd eventually become like this giant mega corporation. where we all were just wearing like rainbow clothes and there would be no more war. And I think that was the assumption a lot of people had after the end of the Cold War. And for a long time, it seemed any kind of regime or movement that tried to go counter to that, be it the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Al Qaeda, etc., seemed like they were kind of these blips that would show up and then immediately get snapped back, and that there just was no more um, historical dialogue or no more historical dialectic. And once again, throughout all of this, I things would happen, and I would say, objectively speaking, this should be a big turning point. This should be a big deal. America's debt reaching these levels, the breakdown of law and order in the inner cities, all this kind of stuff should be important, but it just seems like it's not enough to change the overall picture. Even in a sense, COVID-19 failed to change the overall picture. So I was kind of aware of this at this kind of macro level. And I guess my first thought was there's such a strong normality bias, there's such a strong single current of history at the moment that maybe liberals are right. Maybe it's the end of history, maybe the progressive narrative is correct, and that's just the way things are going to go forever towards one world, towards a blended humanity, towards multiculturalism, that kind of thing. But my perspective of this really started to change when I started kind of following the minutia of the Russo-Ukraine war, because very significant things would happen all the time, and yet the front lines wouldn't move. And they were the kind of things that I would recall reading about, like if I read something about World War II and about Germany running out of fuel, or tanks breaking down, or overextension, or stuff like that. And I'd see these things and I go, this seems like a significant event of the scale that this thing that happened during World War II, and we can look back and say that that event was significant, but at the moment it isn't. My point being that yes, hindsight's 2020. Yes, it's easy to fight the past war, but my point is, when we look at history, we can tell there are significant events. That these aren't all just kind of individual nothing burgers that wind up going in no particular direction. There are significant events, and at least some of the things that we're talking about and we're looking at have to have some sort of significance to them. So then why was it that we seem to be in Schrodinger's war? How can this stuff happen, but it seems like the underlying circumstances completely change, the front line stays the same, everybody, you have all this talk of stuff going on behind the scenes, it doesn't really seem to reflect reality and stuff like that. And I think the answer that I eventually came to was something from stay with me here, the book of Job. So the book of Job is the Bible's attempt to deal with the Odyssey, if I'm pronouncing it properly, or the problem of evil. How can evil and suffering and pain exist in the world with an all powerful, benevolent God? And seems to be an unresolvable question. And it's something that any monotheistic religion has to attempt to resolve. And the explanation we get in the book of Job is that there isn't really a satisfactory answer to it. Because when Job calls out God and he's like, look, you did all this stuff to me, like, how can you justify it? And God just starts to go through like all the stuff that happens in the world. Like this, when the mountain goats give birth. Their labor pains. Um, do you know why the wings of the ostrich flop? Did you give the horse its strength? It's just the idea is reality is so complicated that it is to a certain extent a mystery. That it is something where there's so many moving parts and so many moving variables that you can't really define it in simple terms. Actually, the other thing that kind of made me think about this was with regards to movies, because I do a lot of reviews and I'm like, how can this be the worst movie I've ever seen, but this also be the worst movie I've ever seen? And I guess the answer kind of came to me is that it's not simply a question of is this good or bad? It's how is it good? How is it bad? Because something can be bad worse than something else in a particular way, but not in other ways. And I know this sounds very straightforward and this sounds very like obvious, but I think it is something that we often will miss out on. And when we talk about the Russo Ukraine war, I think it can both be true that the whole thing is very complicated and there's so many moving parts. It's very hard to pick an individual one and say this changes everything. This is the turning point, that kind of thing. But I think our minds inherently try to simplify things like that. We try to say, okay, A plus B equals C, but there's all kinds of other letters and other kinds of stuff involved in it. And that's not to say you can't do meta historical analysis. That's not to say that certain things aren't significant. It's just we don't know how many significant things there are. Like Napoleon's defeat in Russia was definitely significant and definitely turned the course of the Napoleonic Wars. But if the bridge hadn't have been blown up early in Leipzig, maybe some other things would have changed. Maybe if Napoleon had have gotten lucky and some of the battles in the defense of France or just something else had changed, maybe that alone would not have been sufficient. So things can be significant, things can be important, but not sufficient in and of themselves. And very hard to know how many significant events, how many critical events, how many turning points a conflict or an event or a process has within it until it gets resolved one way or another, if it ever does get resolved. Sorry if I'm jumping around a bit. Like when we think about World War II, what are some of the critical points in it? Britain succeeding in evacuating its army at Dunkirk. Things might have turned out very differently had the British not been able to do that. It got captured, destroyed. Germany failing at Stalingrad, as that prevented them from cutting off the Soviet Union's oil supply from the Caucasus. Hitler's decision to stop hitting airfields and just start terror bombing London. These things are all significant. None of them is alone sufficient to explain the course of World War II, but I'm saying I don't think it's necessarily the whole butterfly thing is necessarily the case. It's not that everything is of equal significance. It's just there's a lot of significant things that happen, and it's often difficult to tell which significant thing or which combination of significant things are what influences the ultimate outcome of an event. So I think rather than say this is the turning point or this is important or this is the beginning of the end, you kind of have to divide things into major or minor factors or major and minor events. Like for instance, we talk about how the Russo-Ukraine war has changed because the whole Israeli Hamas thing happened and all the weapons are now getting diverted, but the front line has not collapsed yet at least, nor did it immediately collapse after the weapons got diverted. So that was significant, but not necessarily a sufficient cause for the entire war to flip. But I would say, looking back on it, we will say eventually that that was one of the major turning points in it. Also, it's just once again, it's going back to the whole Book of Job thing. It's your experience as a human is there's a certain number of factors involved in your life and a certain number of things that are happening. And past a certain point, it's not that you can't comprehend it. It's not that you can't train your mind to think a certain way and kind of consider uh, like a million different factors, but it's just not natural. It's just not how you normally would approach your daily life. So it's if you're looking at maybe like three or four different events, but there's like 10 going on, then it can be kind of difficult and taxing on your brain. And you tend to give overdue influence to some and just filter out others because you can't think of it all at the same time. So I guess my simplified reason for why things seem to happen and not happen, or why events seem to be both significant and insignificant, is just that it's complicated. That life is complicated and the world is complicated. And as a human, you're never going to have a complete picture of things. There's so many things going on. I think what we have to kind of do though is say, is this significant? Is this insignificant? Does this affect the overall picture? Does this not affect the overall picture? So I'm certainly not a like an epistemological nihilist in saying we can't understand the world, we can't interpret things, we can't do history or anything like that. I just think it's always important, maybe, to be a bit more cautious sometimes when we say, oh, this is the turning point that changes everything. To instead say, this is significant, this is important, this is a major event, but we don't know how many major events it's going to take. Maybe a war is like one major event where there's one decisive battle, one side gets completely blown out, and it ends there, or maybe it's dozens of significant battles fought over a number of years. It varies. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a few. So when we're approaching things like the rise and fall of America as a global superpower, the Russo-Ukraine war, COVID, the global economic system, we don't know how many significant events there are in that process. COVID was definitely a significant event. Is it the event that's going to permanently change everything as we knew it? Probably not. But it definitely is a turning point, and it definitely is something that, looking back on a couple hundred years in the future, we will say, I can see how that impacted the future flow of events. So I'm sorry if that was incoherent and kind of difficult, but it's a difficult topic, and this is something I've been really thinking about for a long time. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope that wasn't too confusing and I at least made you think. It's something I'm trying to work through on my own, as well as you guys. And a lot of what this channel is about is me being real with you and us trying to kind of figure some of this stuff out together. So God bless everybody. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you all again real soon.